Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Go Big or Go Home. I am Old Man Troy, joined by the youngster Kevin Cunningham, also known as Kid Cunny on Twitter. How you doing today, buddy?
Doing good. I was out and about earlier today, walking up and down some streets since it's 70 degrees, and thought about getting ice cream after lunch. Didn't, but it's that warm down here in Jacksonville to get ice cream after lunch. So, how about you?
It is that warm up in Pittsburgh to get ice cream after lunch. It is in the 60s. It is beautiful. It'll be here for a couple more days, and then it'll probably be down to like 10. So the joys of living in the Northeast. You lived in the Midwest. You know what I'm talking about. So, you know, it's amazing that this weather is just unbelievable. I got it's one of those days, flannel shirt day. I love flannel shirts. Got a flannel shirt on today. Windows are open in the studio at home. Actually, it's just a beautiful, beautiful day. And we're going to have a beautiful, beautiful day on this show today. So we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to recap last week and a lot of action. We talked about it on the show last week, Kevin. This past week in the Big Ten was a lot of must-watch, a lot of circles on the schedule, a lot of games we were paying attention to. There's a shakeup at the top. Purdue is now considered the 1 seed, even though they're tied with Wisconsin for the 1 seed in first place. But if the tiebreaker happened today and the Big Ten tournament started, Purdue would be the number 1 seed. Joe Lunardi, 7 teams in the bracketology. I know you're proud of me because I'm now sold on Joe Lunardi's bracketology, and we're gonna dig into it a little deeper because we're gonna look at, and I was talking to you before the show about a specific matchup for Wisconsin. Being a Wisconsin guy that I am, just kind of odd if that's the way that his bracket works out, that Wisconsin could be in some trouble should it work out that way. Michigan State on a downfall, Kevin. We're going to talk a little bit about them. And then Minnesota, who has quietly creeped up this year, is into that solid 5 that I've talked about, the 5 solid teams. And we're going to talk about the traffic jam is no longer in the Big Ten. There's no more traffic jam. The teams are separating themselves. So let's get started. Last week, quick recap, Kevin. I'm going to turn it over to you. A lot to recap from last week in the Big Ten.
Yeah, for sure. And one thing I wanted to get to before I get into last week's action in the Big Ten is I was listening to the show last week, and it sounded like I had this unbelievable lisp, and so I apologize to those that listen to the show on the-grueling-truth, and I'm not sure where that lisp comes from, but if it's up there on the-grueling-truth and you find it hard to listen to me because of it, I guess I apologize. To my knowledge, I don't have a lisp, but if I do, apparently that bad. Like I said, I was listening to the show last week, and it was atrocious. So I apologize.
Well, if they're listening to your lisp, they have to put up with my voice for a whole hour. So, you know, if they're going to put up with my voice, they're going to live with the lisp if you got one. You had mentioned it to me in a text message this week, and I'm like, what are you talking about? Maybe I'm just blind to it. But, you know, the whole thing is, if they're going to put up with my voice for 1 hour, I definitely think they can put up with this so-called lisp that you've all of a sudden acquired late in your life. Maybe it's one of those new young hip things that you guys are into. You know, it's all technology. Maybe now having a lisp and getting it in your 20s, maybe that's the cool thing to do. I don't know. Maybe.
Apparently. I missed the memo, and nobody's ever told me about it, but I guess that's what happened. Anyway, going into Big Ten basketball last week, Indiana lost at Minnesota by 1 point. And Indiana, it was funny because I looked back at the first show that we ever did, which was over a month ago now. This is our 5th show. And Indiana was a 7 seed at that point. And then the next week they dropped to a 9. And then the next week they dropped to an 11. And then the next week they were the first 4 out. And now this week they're the next 4 out. So Indiana went from a very solid 7 seed, and before the year, like we've mentioned many times on the show, they were a top 10 team coming into the year in college basketball. But since we started the show, they were a 7 seed. Now they're barely on the bubble, I guess you could call it. So losing at Minnesota by 1, another chance for Indiana to pick up a legitimate win over an NCAA tournament team, and they failed to do it. This week they get Northwestern at home. So, another chance for a victory, but seems like Indiana's just failing at all those opportunities. Maryland, I talked at the very end of the show last week that, the talent disparity between Maryland and Northwestern isn't as much as people make it out to be. And Northwestern hosted Maryland last week, and all Maryland did was go into Northwestern and win by 10. Now, Melo Trimble absolutely went off. He had a career-high 32 points in that game. And I want to talk a little bit about Maryland and what they're all about, because I'm just not 100% sold on them. But, when Trimble is on, this is obviously a tournament team that could make a deep run, because especially in March, it's about your guards, as long as you're not getting killed on the glass. And Trimble is one of those players that when he gets going, he can beat anybody by himself, because he can put up 30-plus on anyone. So Maryland's an intriguing team. They went to Northwestern, won by 10. And then on the flip side, they go to Wisconsin, so a couple road games, and they lose by 11. And it just kind of, again, sealed my thoughts on Maryland that, this is a team with Melo Trimble and essentially a bunch of young guys. But we can talk about Maryland more in depth later. Michigan beat Wisconsin at home by 6, but no Bronson Koenig in that game, so that was kind of interesting. And then Michigan also went to Minnesota and lost by 5 in overtime. Another really good game between two, I think, definite tournament teams. Michigan State went to Purdue, lost by 17. It realistically wasn't even that close. It was a 20-point game with about a minute left. It was in the 20s for a little bit those last couple minutes, and Michigan State ended up losing by 17. Again, we're going to talk more in depth about Michigan State, but not looking good for the Spartans going forward. Minnesota, we already went over basically both of their big games last week, Northwestern and Maryland. Purdue, again, beat Michigan State, and Wisconsin, we went over those. So that's been this past week in the Big Ten. And one thing that I wanted to mention was Wisconsin, and when they lost at Michigan by 6, no Bronson Koenig, but Koenig's been kind of on and off this entire year. And it seems as though the big three for Wisconsin, and Happ, Hayes, and Koenig, when they play their best brand of basketball, they can beat teams like Maryland by 11 points. And at the same time, a week ago, they lost to Northwestern without their top scorer. So you look at a Wisconsin team and you see their top 3 players especially, and you think that not necessarily the sky's the limit, but if they surprise people and made an Elite Eight, it wouldn't shock me if their big 3 is playing well. At the same time, you lose to a team like Northwestern without their best scorer, and it's like, at home, and you wonder what the problem is for Wisconsin. So I wanted to ask you, Troy, when Wisconsin turns it on, and they were down by 6 to Maryland at home this past weekend, and then they beat Maryland by 17 points in that second half. So essentially, if you're beating, a 5-6 seed by 17 points in one half, that's pretty good basketball. So when Wisconsin turns it on, and that's been the issue for them all year, can they make a deep run? Is this a team that you expect to make a deep run, or do you expect them to have one of those lulls in a game where they lose to a team that they should beat, or when they play a higher competition, a team with, as much talent as they do, will they just falter because they're inconsistent? So what are your thoughts as a Badger fan? And you've been completely objective on Wisconsin so far on this show, and I expect you to do so going forward. But what do you expect of Wisconsin going forward? Yeah,
well, like you said, I am a Wisconsin fan. Born and bred in Wisconsin. Follow the Badgers very closely. And maybe I'm even more critical. Maybe because I'm a fan. Maybe I'm a realistic fan. You bring up a couple points here, and it's going to roll over to what I talked about in the beginning of the show with Joe Lenardi's bracketology. Here's what I've said about Wisconsin is they definitely have the roster. If you just looked on paper, and these games were played on paper, and the new technology with the Xbox, and they always do these little games and things. If you took that talent and put it into a video game, they would probably make a deep run in this NCAA tournament based on paper, because they could. Do I expect them to? Nope, I do not. And here's why. They can play at a top level, but I haven't seen it. I've not seen those 3 play together all at the same time. Now, they could turn it around, And like you said, the last game, maybe that's what they needed. A loss to Northwestern, lost the second game in a row to Michigan. We're getting their butts handed to them against Maryland in the first half. Maybe that halftime of that Maryland game, maybe that was the turning point. Maybe we're going to see a new Wisconsin team come out this week against Ohio State and Michigan State. 2 games they could win. 2 games that they very well could win. Maybe that was the turning point, because up until that second half, like you said, this team, and I'll say the words again, has been robotic, going through motions, thinking that just because I have a skill level, we're going to win. And they were taking care of business. They were winning. They were winning games. But I said even through the winning streak, I was not impressed with the way Wisconsin was playing. You never want to lose games, ever. But maybe these 2 losses late in the season in the Big Ten is what Wisconsin needed to realize. We still have to go to work every day. How do we get on the same page? Because when those top 3 are on the same page together, Kevin, they can take down almost anybody. Because defensively, I would have to put them as one of the top 10 in the nation. They're very good defensively. The problem is, if they can't score offensively, it doesn't matter how good they are defensively, because they play the same game. And that's what I was telling you before the show. If Joe Lunardi was the crystal ball and was exactly right, the way he has it paired up now, West Virginia, Princeton playing the bottom part of that bracket. And so if they got by with Syracuse in the first round, which Joe Lunardi has them paired up against, they would have to play against a West Virginia team that is very good defensively, a Princeton team that's always based on defense in low-scoring games. And the problem Wisconsin has, Kevin, in low-scoring games, they usually come out on the short end of the stick, because offensively, they're just as horrid as the other team. But if Hayes and Happ and Koenig can all get into the zone at the same time, you could see a Wisconsin team sitting in the Elite Eight. I wouldn't put them Final Four, but I would say Elite Eight. But very good defensively, and I'm just hoping as a fan that was the second half they needed against Maryland, because every once in a while it's those momentum shifts in the season that need to take place for a team to turn it around. And maybe that was it. Because Maryland, like you said, when Trimble is on, they can take down anybody in the Big Ten. They really can. The problem you have there is, can he sustain that for 6 games in the NCAA tournament? And I don't think he can. That is a lot of effort to go through night in, night out. You've got to get help somewhere else. And Melo doesn't have it. But could they win 1 game, 2 games on emotion? Sure. But I can't see Maryland making a deep run, Kevin, because they don't have the supporting cast. Flipping back to Wisconsin in my point, they could have those 3 guys playing together, and maybe one doesn't. It doesn't have to be all 3 on the same night. Maybe Happ's having a bad night, and then Hayes is draining it from outside and playing good defense and getting some rebounds, and Koenig running the offense, getting his assist-to-turnover ratio up, doing those small things, and then Koenig chipping in his 10 to 12 points. They could get a run going, even if not all 3 are on at the same night, but they have to have 2 of the 3 always operating on a high level to win. And if they do that, yeah, sure, they could make a deep run. But going back to what you were saying, Maryland, yeah, they could win in the first round. They could win in the second round. But for them to put together a 6-game run, I just don't see it happening. So there's my long thought about Wisconsin. Hopefully that made sense to you.
No, yeah, it made perfect sense. And I think that a couple points going off what you just said. You mentioned that you're a fan and how you're probably more critical of Wisconsin than the average human because you're a fan. And some people think, fans, short for fanatic, and you think your team is the greatest and you cheer for your team no matter what, even if there's a scandal going on. Players going to jail, coaches going to jail, doesn't matter. That's my school. I care about them. My school is great. They do nothing wrong. And then there are some fans, like you said, that are actually educated and watch most of the games. And a Wisconsin fan like you, for instance, and I'm not just blowing smoke up your butt, but just to have a brain and to watch a team's games, 75, 80% of their games throughout a year, you're going to have more knowledge than a guy like Jay Billis or Joe Lunardi, who's not going to watch every single game of Wisconsin throughout the year. So I think that the smart fans for certain teams know a lot more than anyone else, because no analyst or expert or bracketologist watches 80% of teams' games like hardcore fans do that have a brain. Like I said, you're going to have some fans that think your school can do nothing wrong and your team is a lot better than they actually are. But like you've been saying on this show all year, that Wisconsin has not been playing up to their potential, and they're going through the motions. And there was even a time early in the second half against Maryland when it seemed like everyone on the court was walking around, including Maryland. But they were literally walking around, and Wisconsin got a loose ball, and Nigel Hayes threw up like a 16-foot jumper, and it went in. And I was like, was there a whistle that went on? Because it seemed like nobody had heart, nobody cared, nobody ran for the ball, nobody jogged. It was like everyone was literally walking while Wisconsin was on offense and got a loose ball and scored. It was weird to me because there was just no effort or emotion. Obviously, Wisconsin picked it up and killed Maryland in that second half. But I think it just went to my point and basically calling you a smart fan, and how smart fans can understand their team and know more than basically any other person in the country about their team because you're watching most of the games. But anyway, going back to Wisconsin, you mentioned that the 5-12 matchup, they're going up against Syracuse. I think Syracuse's lengthy defense could absolutely give Wisconsin trouble, because if you're not penetrating that zone and if you're not hitting deep from three, which Wisconsin's been very inconsistent offensively all year, they could lose in the first round. At the same time, you have a West Virginia team in the second round. If, like you said, Joe Lunardi is a perfect crystal ball, West Virginia is a top 5 defense as well, so that's going to give Wisconsin hell. So it's hard to envision some of these teams like a Maryland right now on the 6 line, Wisconsin on the 5 line. It's hard to see basically any team in the Big Ten making a deep, serious run, because unless you're a top 2 seed, realistically, top 3 seed, if you're a really good 3 seed, if you're in the 4, 5, 6, 7 lines, that means in the second round you're getting a really tough opponent. If you're a 2 seed, in the second round, at best, you're getting a 7 seed. That's your second round opponent. So it's funny to me when coaches talk about, seedings and, oh my God, the NCAA tournament listed you as a 3 seed. What do you think about that? And the coach is like, well, we don't care. It's all about matchups, and it is all about matchups. But at the same time, if you get a 3 seed and you're playing a 6 or 11 in the second round, that beats if you're an 8 or a 9 playing a 1 seed in the second round. So seedings mean a lot, realistically. It means essentially the better you do, the easier course you should have to a Final Four or a championship, especially a Final Four, because that's all you can control in your own region. But so these coaches that don't care about what seeds they have or how they're playing, or who they're playing, it's not all about, I guess, what's in front of you, because like I said, if you're Wisconsin and you're a 5 seed, that means you're probably getting a 4 seed in the second round. You're not a 1 seed, you're not a 2 seed getting a mediocre team in the second round. It means you're getting a legitimate West Virginia team, like I said, that gives anyone hell and plays full court defense, stealing the ball, causing the most turnovers in the country. That's what you're getting in the second round. So yeah, it does matter what seed you have. So I guess just a quick little rant there. But so especially with the Big Ten this year, and what that point goes to is that even Purdue's a 4 seed. So in the second round, they're playing a 5 seed. Since it's against the Cincinnati team right now that Lunardi expects that to be. But, you could have a 5 seed like Virginia, and Virginia can absolutely beat anyone. Or a Wisconsin even, a 5 seed that can absolutely beat anyone. So it matters where you're seated, realistically, whether coaches want to believe that or not. It definitely matters where you're seated. And the top teams in the Big Ten this year, it seems like aren't going to get higher than a 3 seed. And teams like Wisconsin, if they lose a game or two down the stretch, and Maryland right now is a 6 seed, that means that, if the Big Ten had one team in the Sweet 16, it would kind of make sense, because they're not supposed to get past the second round, past the third round. If you're a 4 seed or a 5 seed, that means in the Sweet 16 you're likely playing a 1 seed. That's just how the bracket is made up. So it matters where you're seated, despite what coaches say. And when you don't have a top team in your conference, getting that 1 seed, 2 seed even a 3 seed, it just means that your conference is obviously lackluster at the top. And like we've said, and I've said before, the Big Ten, if no team got in the Elite Eight, that's my expectation. I don't expect a big team to make the Elite Eight this year, which is crazy to think about. But even the Sweet 16, if just one team made it in the Sweet 16, that wouldn't surprise me either. I like Purdue a lot, but I don't expect them to beat a Villanova, a Kansas, a North Carolina, Gonzaga. You know, those teams are insanely talented. So the Big Ten success this year, it's as a conference and a fan of the conference, you're going to have to watch the first couple games, because after the first couple rounds, there could be 1 or 0 Big Ten teams going forward.
I'll tell you what, Kevin, I doubt that this would happen. All Big Ten teams could lose in the first round. I mean, they realistically aren't going to do that. Somebody's going to win. Well, you know, now that I said that, now it'll probably be fruition. But each of these teams, we talked about this, the traffic jam is no longer in the Big Ten. I've been a stickler on saying there's 5 solid teams. I said you could argue and get me a 6th team. Joe Lunardi says there's 7. I don't see the 7 right now, and if there is, it goes back to the point that we've made all year, that this is really a down year in college basketball, because right now that 7th team would be Michigan at 17-10, and then Michigan State right above them at 16-11. On a normal year, Kevin, and when I say normal, I'm air quoting, on a normal, good, solid basketball year, you're looking at 16-11, not even sniffing a chance at the NCAA. Now, I'm going to throw a little wrench here, because the logjam has changed a little bit, and the frontier of the conference has changed, with Purdue, Wisconsin, Maryland, Northwestern, Minnesota securely running away from the pack and saying we're the 5 that are going to be there for sure. Then you have Michigan State and Michigan, and I think Michigan's playing really good basketball right now. But then you got Iowa, Penn State, Nebraska, all at 6 and 8. They've pretty much played themselves out of the NCAA tournament. What I mean by that is knocking each other in and out. They're beating each other up, and their record is fluctuating between 6 and 7, 6 and 8, 7 and 8, and they're in sense knocking themselves out of contention, because they're not pulling themselves out of the pack. They're just staying in the pack, winning a game, losing a game, winning 2, losing 3. That's the way it's going, knocking themselves out of any possible contention. Now here's where the wrench comes in, Kevin. You're looking at the bracket, and you're looking at these mid-majors and smaller conferences where there's not a lot of dominant teams that are like in second place. So you've got that one team in that conference that is like, oh, you know, I'm going to come in and I'm going to win the conference title, regular season, and the conference tournament, and boom, I'm the team that's in. Where the wrench could really make a problem this year, Kevin, is that you have that team that's the 4 seed winning the conference tournament. I don't know if there's any mid-majors that have those at-large bids. That could help Michigan State and Michigan that are sitting at 16-11 and 17-10, where in years past, in those mid-major conferences, you had that team that would, like a Wichita State, that was dominating through the regular season. If they faltered in the conference tournament, they were still going to get an at-large as a mid-major. I don't see at-large bids coming from mid-major conferences this year. Do you?
There's certainly very few. Wichita State's not a vintage Wichita State team, and even at this point, they're a 9 seed, according to Lunardi. So and Wichita State's lost like 4 games, I believe, this season. It's no more than 5. But so they've got, you know, one of those 22-5, 23-4 records right now. I could look it up, but that's the record at this point, and they're a 9 seed. So this isn't exactly what you said. Mid-majors don't have the teams at the top, like you said, to ensure themselves bids. And so even if there are conference bid stealers where, like you mentioned, a 4 seed in the conference tournament upends a Wichita State, and Wichita State's a bad example here, but a team like Belmont, for example, a 13 seed right now. If Belmont lost in the conference tournament, they're probably not good enough to beat out these 10, 11 seeds, 12 seeds. to get in the bubble. So if you're a bubble team this year, you're not necessarily afraid of conference bid stealers because those teams like Monmouth and Belmont, on the 13-12 line at best, Valparaiso's a 14, UNC Asheville's a 14. If those teams don't win their conferences, they're just straight up not getting in. It's not as though a UNC Asheville is going to beat out a Michigan State this year, even though Michigan State's, 16-11 overall. So it's a big year for the bubble teams because of how mediocre it is this year. And at the same time, like I mentioned, these top conference teams outside of the Power 5 schools aren't as gaudy as they usually are. Wichita State's kind of the exception, and yet they're still a 9 seed. So you're on the bubble, and, while you're sweating it, as long as you're 16-11, 17-11, 17-10, you're still kind of fine as long as you're in one of the top 5 schools or top 5 conferences, and you've got, a good win here and there. That's what's keeping Michigan State alive, 16-11. They're 5th in the Big Ten, which is automatic, tournament bid in years past, but they're only 16-11. It's crazy. And Michigan State, I certainly wanted to talk more about them. If they win a couple of these last 4 games and lose a couple of these last 4, that's what they're probably predicted to do. They've got Nebraska at home this week. They've got Wisconsin at home. You kind of expect Wisconsin to win that, but it should be a decent game. And then the last 2 games at Illinois, which they should win, and at Maryland, which they should lose. So, they could split, and Michigan State could end up with an 18-13 record, and that wouldn't surprise anyone. And then in the first or second round of the Big Ten tournament, if they face one of those top seeds like Wisconsin or Maryland or Purdue again, they could very well lose in the first round or even the second round. And so even if they pick up 1 win in the Big Ten Conference tournament, you're sitting at 19-13 at that point. You end the year 19-14. Michigan State could be the 5th seed and end the year at 19-14 overall and lose their first game of the tournament or second game of the Big Ten tournament. That's how down the Big Ten is this year. And to say that Michigan State is clearly on the in the bubble at this point isn't exactly a lie because they're a 10 seed right now, according to Lenardi. So a 16-11 overall team who's 5th in the Big Ten is a 10 seed. So it's crazy to think a 16-11 team is in the tournament, but it's also crazy to think that a 16-11 team is 5th in the Big Ten. That's kind of how down the Big Ten is this year. And Michigan State, this past week they beat Ohio State by 8 at home. That was great. And then they went to Purdue and lost by 17. Like I said earlier to start the show, that game was in the 20s. Michigan State was down by 20 with about a minute left. And I wanted to mention also that the injury bug that they've had all year coming into the season. They had 2 scheduled big guys in Gavin Schilling and a transfer, which slipped my mind for a couple weeks, but Ben Carter, a transfer from UNLV. Schilling and Carter were supposed to be the starting front court for Michigan State, and we've talked on the show about how Michigan State is lacking size. Nick Ward is their lone big man, and he's just a freshman. That's where all the size is for Michigan State this year, is in one freshman who's not overly dominant. And so you wonder where all the size is, and Schilling and Carter were out before the season even started due to injury. Now, at Purdue, Michigan State also loses, I believe, a 5th-year senior, and maybe just be a 4th-year senior, but Eron Harris transferred from West Virginia. He led West Virginia in scoring, I think, a year ago, and now he lost his rest of the season to a knee injury as well at Purdue. So Michigan State's without their top 2 big guys coming into this year. That's where Michigan State usually has a notch on teams, is they're huge up front. Well, they lost their starting front court coming into the season. And you add this Eron Harris injury, and now you're really a 16-11 team who's without 3 key players that they thought they would have to start the year. And this is why Michigan State is down this year. This is part of why the Big Ten is down this year, is teams like Michigan State have had injury problems. Indiana's had injury problems. Michigan State is very young to begin with. The conference is very young to begin with as well. We talked about Maryland before and Melo Trimble, and then it's a bunch of young guys. Maryland's 2nd, 3rd, and 4th leading scorers this year are all freshmen. So this is why the conference is down this year. Can't speak for the entire country, of course, but Michigan State lost another starting guard, Eron Harris, who led West Virginia in scoring a year ago. That's going to cripple Michigan State going forward. Even at 16-11 overall, it's tough to see Michigan State, winning many games, and especially in the Big Ten tournament, to vault their seed line. And if they make the NCAA tournament, to see Michigan State go one and done wouldn't really surprise me anymore.
Yeah, everybody says Tom Izzo factor with Michigan State. I don't see it this year, Kevin. They're just not playing good basketball. And I know that the injury bugaboo, people can say woulda, coulda, shoulda, but guess what? You can't say woulda, coulda, shoulda when the NCAA tournament starts. You got to play with what you got, and you got to be playing your best basketball at the end of the year. And right now, Michigan State is not playing good basketball. They are an inconsistent team that can put little mini runs together, during a game, and that's what the game is. Everybody that follows basketball, and I would imagine all of our listeners that listen to the show, they know, they've watched basketball, they're educated about basketball, so they know that a 40-minute basketball game, Kevin, is made up of many runs. And who's going to have that last run? Who can sustain the other team's run and not get crippled and get put behind the eight ball? That's what basketball is. There's very few games that you watch that there's not those many runs in. A 10-2 run, a 14-1 run. Those are part of basketball. And Michigan State can do that. They can go on those runs. The problem is they're not doing it consistently. And when you look at Michigan State teams of the past, they've had the talent, they've went on these little runs, and they're scary. I guess that's the word I'll use with Michigan State. They're scary, especially when February and March roll around. Michigan State is not scary to me. I don't see it this year with Michigan State. I mean, you just look, and I know the tournament committee, they look at your last 10. That's something they look at, or even your last 5. And if we go back 5 games for Michigan State, 2-3, a loss to Ohio State and a loss to Minnesota. I'll tell you what, we're going to talk about Minnesota in a little bit. That team, to me, Kevin, right now, when I look at these 5 teams that I've talked about, I think Minnesota's playing the best of all 5. And they've slowly risen to 5th. They started off the conference season not so well, but right now I think they're playing really good basketball. But Michigan State, if you go back in series of 5, they're 2-3 in their past 5. Then the 5 prior to that, they're actually 2-3. So over their last 10, you're looking at a team that's 5-5. And I know that talent-wise they're down a little bit, but woulda, coulda, shoulda is not going to work in the tournament. And they very well could get in because of what I just said before. There are no mid-majors that are going to cause problems for the big conferences, a.k.a. the ACC. 10 teams right now, Kevin, Joe Lunardi has in the bracket. 10. And when I look at the conference, you can argue. I'm not going to argue against the 10. There are 10 teams that could be in this year's tournament. Again, and I'm going to air quote, on a normal year, because I keep saying this year in college basketball is not normal to me. The mediocre play is not normal, but they're going to get 10 in. And so Michigan State at 16-11, like we talked about, should the tournament start today, they would be in, but they don't scare me. The Tom Izzo factor to me is not there this year. So that means the Tom Izzo factor is going to be a reality when March Madness comes around, and Michigan State's going to be in the Final Four, right?
Well, obviously. I mean, obviously, Cassius Winston, team's freshman point guard, Miles Bridges, a freshman wing, are going to lead Michigan State to a Final Four and beat, Gonzaga and beat a Duke along the way and beat Kentucky, and, they'll be perfectly fine now that you said that.
So let's let the listeners know that may have been doing something else and coming back. We are kidding. We don't think Michigan State's going to make a Final Four run. What we're talking about is my predictions that are always the opposite. We had a little Twitter fun the other day, Kevin, that when I say something, don't listen to me, especially if you're in daily fantasy. Go the opposite of what Troy says. But I do want to talk in seriousness, Kevin, about this Minnesota team. I like them. I like them right now. You want to be playing good basketball in February? Minnesota is doing just that. And I'll tell you what, 3 weeks ago, I wasn't sold on Minnesota, but they've put together a very good run here in the past couple of games. And you're talking about going back 5 games. Minnesota's last 5 games, they're 5-0. and they've got some decent wins in there. They beat Iowa. They beat Michigan. I know you're looking before that. I lost to Wisconsin, Maryland. They had that 5-game losing streak. That is what kind of put them back. But I think they learned during that 5-game losing streak because now they're coming out. And, yeah, they snuck by Indiana. But even though Indiana has lost, and it's coming to fruition. We said Indiana may not win a game the rest of the year, and they haven't since we've said that. But they took care of business at Iowa. They took care of Michigan, who is a team that is, many people have, solid in the tournament also, even below Michigan State as that 7th team. So Minnesota, to me, is playing good basketball outside of that 5-game losing streak. And when you look at their upcoming schedule, they've got 2 games that can really solidify their mark. They play Maryland this week, and that's a must-watch game in 2 days on the 22nd. And then they got to end the season at Wisconsin. I think that is a huge game for them. They've got in between their Penn State and Nebraska. I mean, you got to go play. Both those games are at home. Minnesota, Kevin, when I look at this, they could beat Maryland. They really could. I mean, it's on the road, so it's going to be tough. But when you look at this Minnesota team, Kevin, I like them. I'm not saying they're going to make a Sweet 16 run, but I like them the way they're playing right now to make some noise in the Big Ten tournament and to win maybe a game or two in the NCAA tournament. But, again, on the flip side, they could also lose in the first round of the NCAA tournament. But when you look at what they're doing on the court, they have to be somewhat impressive to you right now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you know, if you look at a team who is 8-6 in the Big Ten, that's a down year in the Big Ten, so that, you know, doesn't necessarily mean much. But Minnesota's 20-7 overall. So this is a team that can score it. It's a team who has had issues defensively, but, you know, mainly during that 5-game losing streak. You give up 78 to Wisconsin, you give up 78 to Ohio State, you give up 85 to Maryland. But before that 5-game losing streak, they went to Purdue and won in overtime, but they won at Purdue. Then the game after that, they won at Northwestern. So, you know, this is a team that has the talent. And when I watched them play earlier in the year, I forgot exactly who it was, but it was some random game, and they were playing a team like Michigan State or Purdue or Northwestern, and I was watching them, and I saw athleticism and a team that's got a lot of energy, and they can run up and down the court, and they've got length so they can play good defense during stretches. They've got, you know, a couple shooters. I've liked this Minnesota team to make the tournament for a while, and these last 5 games have proved it. Now, going forward, like you said, at Maryland, that'll be tough, especially on the road. I think Minnesota at home is a lot more dangerous than they are on the road. That's, you know, you can say that about most teams, but I think Minnesota has one of the better home court advantages in the country. And, you know, just going forward, you mentioned, you know, it's funny because you mentioned Minnesota, you know, they could go on a little run. They could win a couple games. And this goes back to the mediocrity in the Big Ten and how lackluster, I guess you can say, some of these teams are, even though we're, you know, trying to build up Minnesota and, you know, saying a bunch of nice things about them. At the same time, they're an 8 seed right now. And so if you're an 8 seed, if you're a 9 seed, even if Minnesota gets to a 7 seed, in the second round you're playing a 1 seed or a 2 seed. That's just how the tournament's laid out. And so being in the pack, in the middle, being a mediocre team, 8-6 in Big Ten play, you lose games you shouldn't have lost. If you're actually good, that's where Minnesota is right now. They're an 8 seed. They're playing Wichita State in the first round. We talked about Wichita State before. They could absolutely lose to a 9 seed. You know, Michigan right now is a 9 seed. Michigan runs hot and cold. VCU's an 8 seed. Northwestern's an 8 seed. You know, all these teams, they kind of run hot and cold, and they're your 8 and 9 seeds. So it's just a mediocre year in college basketball as a whole. I think outside of the top 20. That's been my statement since we started the show, that the top 20 teams really do have a talent advantage over some of these other ones. And even those back end of the top 20 teams aren't consistent. Wisconsin, they're ranked 16th right now. Virginia's ranked 18th. They've, you know, I think they're 2-5 in their last 7 games. Florida State's dropped off. They're the 19th ranked team in the AP poll, the latest AP poll. So even those teams are kind of up and down. And that's your, you know, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19th ranked teams in the country are very up and down. So it's just interesting to see how it's always interesting to see how March Madness plays out. And Minnesota's playing really good right now. And if they get up to a 7 seed in the NCAA tournament, that second round they're playing a team like Louisville or Arizona or Duke or Baylor or Oregon. It's a powerhouse. So it's tough, it's tough to be a mediocre team this year and really get up for that second round game and pull a huge upset. It's just hard because of how mediocre the 8 seeds, the 9 seeds, and beyond that really are this season. Like I said, even the back end of the top 20, your 5 seeds, your 6 seeds, have been kind of up and down. They haven't been consistent. So it's just tough, I guess, going back to my point on the Big Ten, you could have 0 Big Ten teams in the Sweet 16. I expect 1 to end up pulling through, probably Purdue, because that's been my favorite Big Ten team all year. But that's the only one that I really like going into the Sweet 16. Even though Minnesota's playing really good basketball, in the second round they can match up with Kansas, and it could all be over.
You are absolutely right. And I want to, and I didn't even tell you this as we prep for the show, but we now want to talk about that 8th team that's sitting there. And this is an Iowa team. Now, you look at their schedule, Kevin. This is an Iowa team. Should they be able to pull an upset over Maryland or Wisconsin and go 3-1 in their last 4, that would put them at 9-9 in the Big Ten and just at a 17-14 record. Could you debate at that point that with the mediocre play that we've talked about, that could be an 8th team in the Big Ten, an Iowa squad that can sneak in by upsetting a Wisconsin or Maryland? I don't think they're going to win both. And here's the thing, they're both on the road. But it would be a huge win for Iowa. It would be a statement win at the end of the year for the selection committee, and then Iowa would then secure, should they take care of business against Indiana and Penn State, they have to do that, which are no gimmies. But if Iowa went 3-1, Kevin, over their last 4, beating either a Maryland or Wisconsin at their home court, would that be enough for the selection committee to say the Big Ten is going to slide an 8th team called Iowa, making sure everything else is holding true with Michigan State ahead of them? But would that get Iowa into the tournament, Kevin, at 9-9 in the Big Ten, 17-14 overall, before Big Ten play? But would that make Joe Lunardi put in that 8th team in the Big Ten?
On a regular year, absolutely. 9-9 in Big Ten play, you're in the tournament. But 9-9 in Big Ten play, that could be Michigan State this year, and that would end up, in a 17-14 overall season, and no team in the NCAA tournaments, I forget how many years it's been, has made the NCAA tournament with fewer than a 4-game, being 4 games above 500. That's kind of the benchmark. You have to be at least 4 games above 500, or you're not getting in the NCAA tournament. And so at that point, if Iowa pulls off an upset and beats the teams they're supposed to over their next 4, they're 9-9 in the Big Ten, but they're still 17-14 overall. So they've got to win at least 2 games in the Big Ten tournament to make their overall record at least 4 above 500. So I think the answer is no, because even at 9-9 in Big Ten play, to me, you've got to win 3, if not the entire Big Ten tournament. Can Iowa win 3 Big Ten tournament games? I personally don't think so. But even if they did, if they made the finals and say they upset Maryland again, say they beat Wisconsin in these next 4, lose to Maryland, and then in the Big Ten tournament stretch, they beat a bad team in the first round, then they beat a mediocre, Penn State or Michigan team in the second round, and then they get up and upset Maryland. They still have the finals to go. Say they lose that one. You've got a couple nice wins at the end, but you're looking at the overall record, and it's like, well, Iowa's at this point is what, 19-15, and then they go into the Big Ten tournament final and lose to a Purdue or a Wisconsin or a Maryland. I just don't think it's enough this year because of their overall record in general. 9-9 in Big Ten play is great most years. Not necessarily great, but it's certainly good most years. This year you can have an Iowa team who's barely above 500 at 9-9. You could have Michigan State end the year at 9-9. If Michigan goes 2-2 in their next 4 games, they end the Big Ten season at 9-9. They're an up and down team. It's a team that, could finish the year with under 20 wins. So most years, 9-9, Iowa, great. But this year, because of how mediocre I think the league is in general, and how Iowa proved that throughout the season and in their non-conference schedule, that's why they're 14-13 overall right now. So short answer is no. I think they have to win the Big Ten tournament in order to get in. They can make a case because of how weak the bubble teams are. And, if the majority of these bubble teams lose in the first round of their conference tournament, or they go on a little losing streak here to end the year, yeah, I guess it's possible. But I think Iowa has to at least make the Big Ten tournament final game, championship game, in order to have a chance. I think they ultimately have to win it.
I do not envy the selection committee this year, Kevin. I know in prior years we talked, and I even mentioned it earlier on this show, that you have that mid-major that's having this sparkling year at 24-3 or 25-2, and they get upset in their tournament. You're like, well, there's some discussion, but we'll let them in, blah, blah. And then there's some bubble teams, the last 4 in, last 4 out, those decisions. But when I look at it this year, Kevin, there's so many of these teams like Iowa. There's so many of these teams like Michigan. And at the end of the day, do you have to take a look at the name recognition of the conference? And what I mean by that is the ACC, the Big Ten, they play in these big-name conferences. Is that going to play a part in the selection? It very well could. I mean, you're looking at it at teams that are on the bubble, and it's going to be more than just a handful this year. And I think it's across the country, not just in the Big Ten, but I think it's across the country. I know I talked about the ACC, Kevin, and we talked about how dominant that conference was, and being a team and being a conference that is probably the best in the country. And they're the best by numbers with Joe Lunardi with 10, but when you get past their top 6, and Virginia would draw the line for 6, you got a good Miami team at 8-6 in their conference, so maybe I'll go to 7. Syracuse at 16-12. They do pose a threat, like you said, though. Are they a tournament team? I think so. But they're similar, if you look at it comparably to a Michigan State record-wise, 16-12, 8-7 in the ACC, and then you got Virginia Tech, who had a very, I would say, cupcake non-conference. So their overall record's 18-8, but 7-7 in a really good ACC. There's why they're in. Then in Georgia Tech at 16-11, and that's where you draw the line, because then Wake Forest is 6-9, 15-12. But my point here is, you've got a lot of these teams that are on the bubble, like a Virginia Tech. Even though they're 18-8, you got to look at their non-conference cupcake. And Georgia Tech at 16-11. I mean, you got to make decisions. Georgia Tech at 7-7, 16-11, and then a Michigan 7-7 in the Big Ten. Where are you going to go with this? I really don't envy what the committee has to do this year. I know they're going to get a lot of grief. I know people are always on the committee's behind. I'm not going to use the other word because this is a family show. People are always going to disagree with the selection committee, but I'm going to tell you what. Quick thoughts here, Kevin, on the decisions this committee has to make. I think this is going to be harder than ever for 2017.
Oh, yeah. I mean, usually people get mad because there is that mid-major team that went 26-3 during the regular season, and they lost in the semifinals on an upset, buzzer beater, and they don't get in because of how strong the bubble is usually. Usually you win 20 games and you're sweating because 20, it's a nice round number, but if you're 20-11 and you lose in the second round of the Big 12 tournament and your last 10 games you go 5-5, you're not feeling good. This year, if you're 20-11 and you're in the upper half of one of these top 5 leagues, you're feeling really great. That's exactly what Minnesota is right now. They're 20-7. They can end up with 22, 23 wins, but that's Minnesota, Northwestern, Maryland, Wisconsin, Purdue. Those are the teams that are definitely getting 20 plus. outside of that, and this goes to your point earlier about the Big Ten having 5 solid teams. Michigan State's 16-11, and they're a 10 seed. They're clearly in right now, and they're 16-11. Michigan's 17-10. They're 7-7 in a down Big Ten year, and Michigan is what, a 9 seed at this point? So those teams are very comfortably in, and Michigan's on the right side going up. They're a 9 seed. And yet they're a mediocre team, realistically. They're 7-7 in a down Big Ten year. So, yeah, there's only 5, I think, really solid, strong, absolutely in Big Ten teams. And yet, to start the show a few weeks ago, there were 8 teams, according to Joe Lunardi, in a down year in the Big Ten that were making it. Now there's 7, and realistically, like we've mentioned, Michigan's up and down. Michigan State's got injuries up the wazoo. They could easily lose most of the games going forward and end up with a 18-14 overall record and a poor showing in the Big Ten Conference Tournament, and yet they're still in the tournament, in the NCAA Tournament. That's how mediocre this bubble field is. And yes, it does make it harder because instead of having to leave out a couple really good teams here and there, and fans being mad about that, leaving out a 26-3 team or leaving out a great 22-10 Virginia Tech team who won most ACC games in the best league in the country, and oh my God, how do you leave Virginia Tech out? This year you're not leaving teams like that out at all. They're on your 8, 9, 10 seed lines. They're comfortably in. This year you're going to have a bubble where 10 teams are going to be mad because, well, we had a mediocre year just like Michigan had, or just like Michigan State had. Why aren't we in? Teams, just looking at these 16 teams, the last 4 byes, the last 4 in, the first 4 out, the next 4 out, Pittsburgh is on the next 4 out. And we talked about Pittsburgh a week ago on one of your other shows. Pittsburgh lost, I think it was 8 games straight. They're on the next 4 out. If they have a decent run to end the season, Pittsburgh could make the NCAA tournament. Teams like Indiana are on the next 4 out. Texas Tech, Providence, Wake Forest, first 4 out. I like Wake Forest's offense this year, but their defense is atrocious. They're right there for getting in the NCAA tournament. Clemson, very mediocre. Tennessee, I don't even know anything about Tennessee basketball this year. Illinois State's on the first 4 out. Georgia Tech, you already mentioned. These teams that have gone completely up and down are all on the bubble. 16 of these teams, even Syracuse, like you mentioned, I think they're 16-12 overall, you said. Or maybe they're 5 games over 500, so barely in the NCAA tournament. They're in the last 4 byes. If they lose most of their games going forward, they could be out, and Pittsburgh could be in based on what happens. So there are going to be about 10 teams feeling like they should be in, yet they're very mediocre.
How crazy is this, Kevin? That, like you said, I invited you to come on one of the weekly radio shows that I do here in Western PA on WFSN and WXED. We talk Pitt basketball. And we both said on that show, there's no hope for Pitt. And now, all of a sudden, they go out over the weekend, they beat Florida State. And all of a sudden, now they've geared themselves and they've propelled up in the ACC. That's crazy. That is crazy talk that Pittsburgh's even being considered to be in the NCAA tournament. And now it doesn't mean I'm not going to watch, doesn't mean I'm not excited about the NCAA tournament, but the level of play is not that good this year in college basketball. A couple minutes left in the show, Kevin. I want to look ahead to the Big Ten schedule this week. I have 3 games that are really, to me, must-watch games. And I'm going to go over them, and I'm going to get your quick thoughts. First one is Maryland, Minnesota. I think this is a game this week where Minnesota, I just talked about the winning streak. I talked about how well they're playing, but Maryland could damper everything that Minnesota has built up over the last 5 games. But it's a must-watch for me. Maryland, Minnesota. Then the Michigan-Purdue game, to me, is a big game. For Michigan to be able to play Purdue, this is Michigan's statement game to the committee. Look, we're mediocre in the Big Ten at 7-7. If they can beat a Purdue team, for Michigan, that would then solidify and stamp them and put them into that concrete, we're going to the tournament. Should they lose to Purdue and with their schedule, I think they could still be in, but that's another loss. That would be an 8th loss in the Big Ten. They falter one more time, and all of a sudden, going into the Big Ten tournament, they're 8-10 going into the Big Ten tournament. So that's a huge game to me, Michigan and Purdue. And then, believe it or not, I'm not being a Wisconsin homer, but I think a Michigan State-Wisconsin game this weekend is huge. It's a big game, I think, for both teams in a sense. Confidence builder for Wisconsin. We all know Wisconsin is going to be in the tournament. I mean, and there's no way that they're not going to make it, even if they faltered into fourth place in the Big Ten. For Wisconsin, I think it's that confidence game to beat a good Michigan State team. Not a great team, but a good Michigan State team. And for Michigan State, that's the game that they need to show the committee we belong. And I know they're pretty solid at a 10 seed right now, but I look at it and I'm still never confident with it. But for Michigan State to be able to beat a top team in the Big Ten, that is a game that they need. And if that's the Tom Izzo magic, that's the Tom Izzo magic, and this is the time to pull it out against Wisconsin late in the season in the Big Ten, right before the Big Ten tournament. It's a game Michigan State needs, Kevin. So there's my 3 games. Quick thoughts on Maryland, Minnesota, Michigan, Purdue, Michigan State, Wisconsin. And then if you want to throw in any other games that are going on in the Big Ten, I think those are my big 3 must-watch this week.
Yeah, they're the top 3. Northwestern goes to Indiana. I guess that would be the 4th. But, yeah, those 3. Maryland is at home to Minnesota. And imagine if Minnesota goes into Maryland and wins. And Minnesota, at that point, this time next week, Minnesota goes into Maryland and wins. They're, a 7 seed, an 8 seed? Maryland at this point is a 6. If they lost at home to Minnesota, who they should beat, what does that drop Maryland to, a 7 seed? The third best team in the Big Ten is a 7 seed. So it's just insane thinking about some of these scenarios and the third best team in the Big Ten being a 7 seed. Purdue getting in the tournament, Pittsburgh getting in the tournament. It's just laughable at how mediocre college basketball is. And it just takes one upset here and there. You mentioned Michigan getting Purdue at home. If Michigan wins, that's their statement win. They're automatically in. I think Minnesota's probably comfortably in at this point, barring, a 5-game losing streak to end the season. Michigan, I think, still has to win, just be Michigan, be mediocre. If they beat Purdue in Michigan, that's statement game, you're automatically in. If Michigan starts losing games and collapsing and their 3-point shot starts missing, then, Michigan could play themselves out of the tournament. And that goes back to our solid 5 teams where Michigan and Michigan State could be out. And then you mentioned the Michigan State-Wisconsin game. So ultimately, I guess, for Maryland getting Minnesota at home, I like Maryland at home against Minnesota. I don't think an upset will happen there. If the game were at Minnesota, I'd pick Minnesota. But I'll go with Maryland over Minnesota. Michigan playing Purdue. I think Purdue will go on the road and win. I just like Purdue this year. They're, again, my favorite team in the Big Ten, best team in the Big Ten. That's my thought. I guess if there's a little time left, is Purdue your top team in the Big Ten? Do you think they make the biggest March run? Quick answer from you there if there's time. But I like Purdue to go into Michigan and get that win, putting Michigan, back on the bubble. And then you mentioned Michigan State, Wisconsin. Michigan State's at home in that game. And so if there is a time to beat a Wisconsin team who plays up and down and doesn't get up for certain games, Michigan State will be at home to do that. But, again, I think Wisconsin, coming off that Eron Harris injury is just going to hurt Michigan State's morale even more. Wisconsin, all you have to do is get up and play that game. You've got the better team. You've got the healthier team. You've got 3 of the top 4 players in that game on your team. Wisconsin should win that game, especially with Michigan State's spirits at this point where they are, and Wisconsin's spirits after beating Maryland at home. I think Wisconsin goes on the road, beats Michigan State. I like all the top teams, I guess, to win those key 3 games that you mentioned. And Michigan State and Michigan could solely be on the bubble this time next week.
Yeah, again, we're down to the final 4 games, and we're down to the final 2 weeks, and it's going to be really intriguing to see what happens. And that's why I mentioned this Michigan State-Wisconsin game, because for Wisconsin, it's big for seeding in the Big Ten tournament, not to get in the NCAA tournament, but for seeding. And I know that I had mentioned a few shows back, Kevin, and I know we disagree on this. I don't think one of the top 3, Purdue, Wisconsin, Maryland, win the Big Ten tournament. I've said it a couple of weeks ago. I'm not wavering from it, even though when I look at the play. But again, I go down to an Iowa, a Michigan State. These are teams that could win that one game. I don't think they're going to make runs, but what that'll do is, could they knock off a Purdue or Wisconsin or Maryland on a neutral court? I think they could. And I'm not saying they're going to make that run, but that'll open the door for a Northwestern, a Minnesota, a darn Michigan State team, the scary Michigan State Tom Izzo team at the end. It could open the door. You asked if I think Purdue can make a run. Yeah, they could, but so could Wisconsin. I don't think Maryland can. I don't think Northwestern can. If there's two teams in the Big Ten that could represent the conference in an Elite Eight, one would be Purdue, one would be Wisconsin. For any other team that makes the tournament, nothing against them, Kevin, they just don't have the roster makeup. And that's what I look at. I look at the roster. Do you have the depth? Do you have the bigs? And then can you play defense and can you shoot the ball from the outside? Those are things that you have to do, because when you get to the tournament, again, you mentioned it earlier about matchups. Sometimes you got to grind it out inside, and you got to play big. You got to play real big in the middle. Purdue and Wisconsin can do that. But there's other games you have to shoot from the outside. Purdue and Wisconsin can do that. You look at a Maryland, they go as Melo Trimble goes. Northwestern, it's pretty much an outside game. So you get a team that's dominant inside, they can maybe take care of Northwestern. And like you said, you got Michigan State. They don't have the roster makeup to make those deep runs. But Purdue, yes. So I'm saying one of the big three won't win the Big Ten tournament. However, Purdue could win the Big Ten tournament. They could cruise through the tournament. They could make a run to an Elite Eight. I like them. But again, it's that inconsistency, almost like what I'm saying with Wisconsin. Have they put it together to do it? No, they haven't yet. I think Purdue and Wisconsin are really good teams. They just haven't found it yet. And now, could they? I think they could. That's what I'm saying. So hopefully that answered your question. We're just about out of time, so I'm going to turn it back over to you for any last-second thoughts before we let our wonderful listeners go, because they're probably tired of your lisp, and they're probably tired of the old man Troy talking for an hour. But what are your last thoughts on the Big Ten this week?
Well, they're definitely tired of my lisp, my very obvious apparent lisp at this point. Your voice is fine. My lisp is atrocious, though. Last thoughts, I mean, like you said, the top three in the Big Ten could potentially not win the Big Ten tournament, and I like Purdue to win it. If there's another team that does, it would be Wisconsin in my mind. I'm still not 100% sold on Maryland because their number 2, number 3, and number 4 scorers are all freshmen. Outside of Trimble, it's a bunch of young guys. That's all it is. So you got a 7-1 guy, but he's not polished at all. He's not, a difference maker on the inside. Like I said, if Maryland loses to Minnesota at home this week, Maryland could be a 7 seed. And that's your number 3 team in the Big Ten. The top 3 teams, clearly better than the rest of the Big Ten. The 3 that can actually make a run in March, Maryland could be a 7 seed come NCAA tournament time. So that's my quick thought, and you're not crazy for thinking an Iowa or a Michigan or a Michigan State could win the Big Ten tournament, because if your second, third best teams don't get up on a nightly basis and play good basketball, yeah, absolutely. One of those mediocre teams could go on a little run and win the Big Ten. So that's my final thought. Your third best team in the Big Ten could end up being a 7 seed this time next week.
It's crazy. It's crazy. But it's getting to March Madness. We're just a couple days away, Kevin. Next week, who knows what we'll talk about. It's great. That's what I love about college basketball, that the frontier changes on a nightly basis. But hope you enjoyed the show today, everyone. For the youngster Kevin Cunningham, I am Troy Otradovec. Find us on Twitter. I'm at TroyRobert967. Kevin Cunningham is at KidCunny. Hope you enjoyed the show today. We'll get back at you next week. Have a good week, everyone.